Hey everyone, welcome. Today, we're talking about rebellion and independence in the Americas. And this isn't just a story about battles and flags. No, it's about a fundamental revolution in the very idea of reality itself. Okay, let's just jump right in. When we think of revolution, we usually picture armies, falling empires, but the real fight, the one that truly matters, often starts much deeper. It's a struggle over ideas, over power, and really over how we even understand the world around us. And to really get how this all went down, we need to go back. We need to look at a fundamental clash of worldviews that basically set the stage for centuries of conflict. So long before the Spanish ever showed up, the Nahua people of central Mexico had this concept called teotl. Now, this was not some static god just sitting on a cloud somewhere. Teotl was the idea that reality itself is a living, sacred energy. It's always moving, always transforming, always balancing itself. Everything, and I mean everything, was part of this dynamic, sacred dance. And then the Spanish arrived with a totally different framework, a single, distant god who created a fixed, unchanging world. So when they tried to translate Teotl as just God, they weren't just swapping words. They were trying to force this huge, dynamic, flowing reality into a tiny, rigid, static box. This was the first great collision of worlds. And you can see this rigid worldview perfectly reflected in the colonial system they built. I mean, colonies weren't meant to thrive on their own. Their entire purpose was to serve the mother country. Their job was to have their resources extracted, their wealth funneled back to Europe, all to make a distant king richer and to keep power locked in the hands of a tiny, tiny elite. So you have this really oppressive system built on a static, unmoving worldview. But what happens when a brand new set of ideas shows up, challenging the very foundation of that power? Well, that's the spark of revolution. The Enlightenment just completely flipped the script. The old idea was that kings ruled by divine right. God put them there, so you obeyed. No questions asked. But the radical new idea was that people, all people, are born with natural rights, and that governments exist to serve them. And that led to a devastatingly simple question. Why on earth should we obey a distant king who stomps all over those rights? Now, for a long time, this was all just talk, right? Philosophical debate. But then, the American Revolution happened, and that was proof of concept. It showed the entire world that a colony could actually stand up to a massive European empire and win. Suddenly, the unthinkable seemed possible. At the exact same time, the Spanish Empire was just cracking under its own weight. It was way too huge to manage effectively. It was being bled dry by constant wars back in Europe. And it had this super strict social pyramid. And critically, it shut out the Creoles. These were people of pure Spanish blood but born in the Americas. We're talking educated, wealthy elites. And man, they were getting really tired of being treated like second-class citizens. Ideas and weaknesses, they create opportunity. A perfect storm, really. But you still need leaders to turn that opportunity into action. And right on cue, all across the Americas, those leaders began to emerge. First, you have to look at Haiti. Toussaint Louverture, a formerly enslaved man, led a revolution that did the impossible. It overthrew the French colonizers and created the very first independent nation in Latin America, and the first one in history to be led by former slaves. It sent a massive shockwave across the entire world, proving that even the most oppressed people could seize their own freedom. Then you've got Simón Bolívar in South America. He was a Creole aristocrat, totally fired up by those Enlightenment ideals of liberty. He became El Libertador, the liberator, waging this continent-spanning war that freed multiple nations from Spanish control. We're talking Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. And in Mexico, the spark came from a priest, Miguel Hidalgo. His famous Cry of Dolores wasn't just some political call for independence. No, it was a gut-level cry for social justice that ignited this massive popular uprising among indigenous and mixed-race people, and it fundamentally changed the course of Mexican history forever. So the empires fall, and these new nations are born. Victory, right? End of story? Well, this is where things get a lot more complicated. The reality after independence was often very, very different from the revolutionary promise. All of the leaders were talking the talk, freedom, natural rights, equality. But once the dust finally settled, you have to ask, who actually benefited? What did freedom really mean on the ground for everyday people? Just look at who held the power. Before independence, it was the Peninsulares.
the ruling class born in Spain. After independence, power just shifted over to the Creoles, the elite of Spanish descent who were born in the Americas. So power wasn't really distributed, was it? It just changed hands, right at the very top.
And for the vast majority of people, real freedom was still just out of reach. The old social hierarchies, they pretty much stayed in place. Indigenous peoples kept losing their lands and being marginalized. And in many of these new nations, the institution of slavery actually continued for decades. So the bottom line is this. The revolutions achieved political independence from Europe? Absolutely. But they failed to bring about a true social revolution. The fundamental structure of inequality simply survived the change in flags. And this brings us right back to where we started, doesn't it? A true revolution, a deep one, isn't just about swapping out who's in charge. It's about challenging the very ideas that we use to justify power and define what justice even is.
And when you think about it that way, you can almost see history itself as being like teotl. It's not a static, finished story in a textbook. It's a dynamic process, a constant, messy, powerful motion, and it's all driven by that tension between the old, rigid systems and the new, transformative ideas.
The revolutions in the Americas absolutely changed the world, but they also left so much unfinished. Which kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about. If this process of change is constant and the struggle for true freedom and justice continues, where is all that motion taking us next?